And we're live.
Welcome to the Transformational CFO, a forum presented by WilliamsMarston,
where we will explore innovative strategies that influential CFOs and other finance leaders deploy as they navigate critical transitions and drive transformations in these challenging times. I'm Landon Williams.
I'm John Marston, and we are the co-founders of Williams Marston.
Our guest today is Richard Puccio, Executive Vice President and CFO of Analog Devices. Rich, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Landon.
Rich, you've had a very successful career, more than 20 years as an audit partner at PwC on some of the largest and most dynamic tech companies like EMC and Dell. Then you moved into industry as CFO of Amazon Web Services. Most recently, you stepped into the CFO role at Analog Devices. Can you take us through your career and some of the key experiences that shaped your decisions along the way?
Sure. So interesting, I came out of a non-traditional background. I came out of a college with an economics degree and then went into accounting. So that was my first unique start. One of the things I learned very early was the faster I could get broad experience with a bunch of different industries and a bunch of different partners and teams, the faster I'd be able to accelerate how I could help customers and clients and generate value. So as I progressed, I worked with more and more groups of partners and teams, expanding my skill sets. And what that allowed me to do was get brought on to really strong accounts in the firm, which helped me get even more acceleration. And then I would say, around the time PW and C&L merged, it became clear at the level I was in the company that you needed to specialize. And it was at that point that I switched over to a technology specialization. I spent the majority, if not all of my time on technology companies. And I was very fortunate. I had everything from early stage venture-backed companies all the way up through some of the largest global multinationals that PwC worked with. So I had tremendous opportunity to see different operations domestically, globally, different types of industries within tech. So I worked with semiconductors and semiconductor capital equipment companies, did a lot of work with software companies, did a lot of work with IT infrastructure companies, worked with a lot of the big public companies in the Boston market. And that set of skills is what set me up for the opportunity that came to leave PwC after almost 29 years at the firm. I left to go be the CFO at AWS. And that was a pretty dramatic change. But what I found was the skills you learn in public accounting really do prepare you for a lot of that work that comes in being a CFO. And so I think that was, a really important part of my progression. And then obviously the opportunity at ADI came, and that was another big change, moving from a division CFO role at a really big company to a overall CFO in a large public company brings an entirely new host of challenges. So for me, it's always been about opportunity to learn, get new skills, and apply them in the environment I work in.
What have been the more challenging aspects of moving from audit partner to CFO, and what have you found the most rewarding?
So it's interesting. Probably one of the most challenging things is the breadth of responsibilities that comes in the CFO role. We often on the advising side and on the PwC side are very focused in a particular set of functional areas, right? So expert in doing M&A and doing financial reporting, accounting, et cetera. But you take on the CFO role and you have to take on external stakeholder management. You have to take on responsibility for things like treasury, real estate, a host of areas like that. And that's a big change because it requires you to be much more nimble and agile because you can't be focused solely on one thing at any time. I thought that was a big challenge. One of the things that's really rewarding is helping develop, build a plan, run operations, and deliver on a plan is super rewarding work. Very exciting to see your plan go into action and help guide teams through execution. And the other thing, and this is one of the things that I enjoyed most about my time in public accounting, is building and leading great teams. And been able to do that across my public accounting time and then at two public companies. And that's been, really rewarding for me because I think we have a responsibility as CFOs to build the next generation of leaders.
And you mentioned some of the challenges in making that transition to CFO. Have you been able to rely on advisors like the treasury area you mentioned and other areas of the business as you get up to speed?
So one of the things, I did early on, particularly in my most recent role as the ADI CFO, was deep diving all of the functional teams in my organization. So spending time with my treasury team, as you described, I have very experienced. My current treasurer has been with ADI for 16 years, and he's broad and deep in treasury. He also has responsibility, which means I do for insurance. So we spend a lot of time talking to what our insurance and risk management practices are. So I've been able to do that internally. And then we work with a broad set of advisors externally. Think about the broad activities in a public company, whether it's, our auditors, folks that help us with valuations. We have folks that work with us on our insurance quoting. So, there is always a balance. I'm a big believer in leveraging both sets of skills, but making sure we're building them internally as well. I like to have the core skills that are critical inside the organization as well.
Surrounding yourself with experts is important, I'm sure.
Hire smart people and get out of their way.
Right. Words to live by.
That's right. Rich, any advice for more senior level audit folks thinking about making the move to industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've actually fielded that question a lot. Well, one of the things is you have to understand and take an inventory of your skills, capabilities, and then think about where your passion lies and where you're going to be able to be super interested in the work. Because one of the things, you're very focused in the world in public accounting, and then you've got to make this big jump. And I think one of the things actually that folks in the public accounting firms do is they underestimate the skills they have and their relevance in the market. So understanding that inventory of skills, but then also looking for the things where you can continue to bring value to an organization. If you were to leave PwC, one of your first questions is, if I go there, can I add value? Because that's the way the company's going to think about you. Do you add value to the organization? And I think that folks with the public accounting background can do that very well.
Sage advice. Can you tell us a little bit about ADI or Analog Devices business and what the company does and who are its customers?
Sure. So Analog Devices is a global semiconductor manufacturer. Grew up as a company here in New England. Matter of fact, ADI just celebrated their 60th anniversary, and the odds of making it 60 years as a public technology company are incredibly low. So fantastic achievement, and we're looking forward to the next 60. So the best way to think about us is we provide semiconductors across almost all of the things that you think about in your life. So we think about things across sort of 4 end markets. Our company has been built on, and the foundation is our industrial base. So we sell semiconductors into industrial companies, whether that's chips that go into test equipment for semiconductors, chips that go into factory automation. Second large market for us is our automotive market. So if you think about the car of today, all of the electronic components in the car, all the sensors, microphones, cameras, those all require connectivity. They all require sensing. They all require power. Those are all areas where we provide the products. So if you remember during the pandemic when people couldn't get a car, it was the first time people really started to understand how ubiquitous semiconductors were, because a single chip missing in the key part of a car was keeping them from shipping.
Wow.
So those are the 2 biggest parts of the company, but then we also play in the consumer space. So if you think about the sensors that might be in a hearable, a wearable, hearing aids, game consoles, our semiconductors are in those products, and then also in the communication space, whether it's in a wireless communication and our chips are in the base stations, whether it's in wireline communications where we have chips that are in the networks controlling optical connections across servers in a data center. If you look across, it's incredibly broad and diverse. But if you think about the core analog part of our business, if there's a physical item that needs to be measured or controlled, those are our chips. So sensing temperature, wind, sensing things in your body, controlling motion in devices, whether it's a robot arm in a factory. So we are broad and deep. And so our customers are the people you might think about, the leading industrial suppliers, leading automakers, telecommunications companies, and some of the biggest names in consumer.
Yeah, that's phenomenal.
It is. You've already shared that when you joined Analog Devices a little over a year ago, you did a deep dive into each of the major functional areas, certainly under the CFO. What are your aspirations, for the function, and what are you looking forward to accomplishing over the next 5 years?
So it's interesting. The aspiration for the function certainly is to continue helping the broader enterprise deliver value. And, I think the finance team has an opportunity across any number of the disciplines to increase that value. Now, one of the things we are super focused on, if we look at our priorities, is increasing our automation, increasing the speed of our execution, and increasing the insights we provide to the business. And this is a critical area for every finance and organization I've worked with, is how do we get more efficient and have people spend more time on that value add activities where we're delivering insights to our business leaders to help them make smart business decisions. The other thing what we want to do, we've started to grow again, right? We want to grow faster, and our ability to help the business do that is enabling them with the right tools and technologies, whether it's helping them with their go-to-market, helping with our supply chain. All of those are areas where finance has influence. So for us, it's to continue to improve our efficiency and effectiveness and help drive the business forward.
Yeah, that's great. We've seen in our own business, we're working with 12 to 1,500 companies in a given year, and a growing part of our business has been finance effectiveness, where we're coming in and helping the companies to streamline, to automate, close the books faster, spend more time analyzing and less time on the historical number creation. So that's very consistent with what we're seeing in the market. Rich, we're in a fluid economic situation right now. Obviously, tariffs were announced, caught a lot of people by surprise. How is this impacting analog devices, and what are you most focused on as you lead the company through this heightened period of uncertainty?
So it has introduced a level of dynamic change different than probably most leaders have seen over the course of their career. I've been around a long time, and this is very different than anything I've seen before, both in the speed and unpredictability of the changes. But I would tell you from an ADI perspective, and I've talked about this publicly as well, one of the things we're most concerned about is the potential impact on the global macroeconomic environment and the potential for being pushed into a global recession. And if not a global recession, at least the risk that there's some demand destruction for us. We've spent the last several years investing very heavily in building an agile and resilient manufacturing team and process. So we feel very good about our ability to adapt and change. But what we don't control is what happens to overall demand if there is a permanent reset in pricing. And is that a temporary shock or a medium or long-term shock? So we spend a lot of time, right these days doing scenario planning. What other potential outcomes? And I think that's the pressure most CFOs are under right now, is understanding what the implications are. And it's implications from where your customers are to where you manufacture, where you assemble. Those factors all have to be considered. So that is a significant area we spend a lot of time on and will continue to spend time on.
Right. Well, you mentioned scenario planning. Many of our public clients do risk assessments periodically. How important do you think that is for analog devices? I mean, do you think it's valuable, or is it impossible to predict some of these events?
So I do think a overall risk management process at the company level and then at a more detailed level is critical. And in fact, we do very regular risk assessments. I think that allows you to identify the places where you might have exposure and decide whether you have mitigation or have a plan you can rapidly implement to drive a mitigation. And my experience over a number of years with unplanned events, unexpected events, is you're much more able to react quickly with velocity if you've got a pre-planned playbook, for lack of a better description. Understanding in this event, here's how we would react. A classic example of that would be, and everybody's got them at this stage of the game, what do you do if you're subject to a cyber attack? Trying to figure that out on the fly, really difficult. And it also puts an inordinate amount of strain on the organization. But if you've got a playbook, at some level, we can't have a playbook for everything. And certainly the tariffs, the way they've been implemented, I don't think was in anybody's playbook. But we've been quickly building a playbook, as I suspect many of my peers are, as this develops. Fortunately, the pause given us a little more time to think about what it could look like going forward. But I do think having that risk management and risk assessment is really important.
It definitely seems like over the last 5 years or so, we've had the pandemic shock, then the inflation shock, now the tariff shock. These risk assessments are becoming more important as we go. Rich, Sarbanes-Oxley's been around for 20 years now. We hear rumblings that the PCAOB may be scaled back or dissolved or rolled up under a different agency. What is your view of Sarbanes-Oxley as a former audit partner and now a CFO?
So interestingly, I was in the first wave of PCAOB reviews in the very first year they did them. And then I think by the time I finished, I went through at least 10. So I have a bit of perspective. Look, I think the SOX rules were well-intentioned, and I think that they have continued to evolve over time. And we've seen ebbs and flows, right? Where the PCAOB has pushed in particular directions, changed, and pivoted again. And I think that it is going to continue to be critical for them to adapt and to change as the environment and the technology changes. I think about the old public accounting world, how audits are done and how companies work, because some of the traditional things aren't going to be effective going forward. I do think that SOX brought some benefits because it has forced a level of internal control consistency across the public markets that didn't exist. Do I think it's been onerous at time and over the top? Absolutely. But overall, it has certainly forced a more level playing field for understanding the control environments at public companies.
Do you think it should be more geared towards Fortune 500 companies and it's too onerous for the smaller publics, or any views on that?
This might not be popular, but I don't think it should just be restricted to the Fortune 500 because I think investors, big and small, should enjoy the same transparency across whether it's a small company or a large company. And I get it. It's part of the calculus, having worked on IPOs, of are we the right kind of company to be public? Can we afford the infrastructure? Does it make sense? I get it. Those are really hard decisions and entrepreneurs have to make those decisions. But I think some form, and look, there's ways to do a SOX light approach before you're a public company to prepare. There's a lot of different avenues, but the current environment certainly would indicate they'd like to be less regulatory, but I do think that there's important benefits.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely hear that the administration wants to reduce regulation. They want more public companies, and so that's one I think they're looking at closely to assess whether it's one contributing factor to kind of less companies going public.
Rich, technologies like AI are reshaping the way companies operate. And you've also shared within the finance function, you've got goals to automate more. How are you thinking about AI and other emerging roles in technology within the finance function, whether it be planning, forecasting, streamlining operations?
So from my perspective, I've dealt with this in some of the simplest ways. We would call AI slash, I would say AI ML, because a lot of what you hear about is AI is actually machine learning, which has been around for a long time. And that's a lot of what you see in the forecasting and demand planning world. What I found is our teams spend an incredible amount of time gathering data, sorting data, trying to make sure the veracity of the data before they spend 1 minute on analyzing it, providing insights to a leader. So in the finance world, I think that there is great opportunity to improve efficiency by automating as many of those repeatable, mundane tasks as you can using AI and ML technologies. Certainly from a overall forecasting perspective, being able to run models that are programmed with the right algorithms, with the right econometric analysis to help you with forecasting. There's always a human element, even with an AI forecast, but the ability to use those forecasts for demand planning, supply chain planning, and for build planning. Sometimes we forget about that. There's people actually building things out there, and you can automate and have an automated feed that runs from your demand plan into the system that produces the bills, the bombs for what you're going to manufacture. And today, that's all in a lot of places, hard grinding spreadsheet work to do all that matching, or less sophisticated tools than AI. So I think there's a ton of opportunities for companies to get benefit out of AI. And look, that's the value proposition that the providers have to deliver on is, do we get real yield, whether it's operational efficiency and effectiveness or actual cost savings out of AI? But I do think there's tremendous opportunity. And you're seeing it. I had an example with one of my teams that actually built a chatbot. In over a course of a 2-week sprint, they built a chatbot that I was able to ask questions, natural language questions, something like, show me my sales by region for the last 3 years by quarter and by country. And the chatbot took my input, wrote the SQL query to go into our systems, find the data, populated a Tableau, QuickView, whatever your analytics platform of choice is, and there it was in front of me. And it took me longer to describe what it did than how long it took the system to actually do it. The power of that from an efficiency perspective is phenomenal. And I know that kind of work is happening all over the place.
That's impressive. You've also seen a lot of M&A in your career. While some deals are successful, many aren't. Will M&A be a core part of the finance strategy at ADI?
So at ADI, M&A has absolutely been a core part of our strategy. If you think back, gosh, I guess you go back 10, almost 11 years ago, ADI did its first transformative acquisition where they bought Hittite Microwave. Then they followed that on with an acquisition of Linear Tech. And then they did what at the time was one of the larger tech acquisitions when they bought Maxim. And that combination has transformed ADI into what it is today. At the peak of the cycle, ADI was a almost $12.5 billion company. So M&A has been critical to adding products, adding functionality, adding customers. All of those things have been really important. However, we have talked about this a lot publicly. We are investing heavily organically in software, digital, and AI to help enhance the value of our core analog portfolio. So if you think about the ability to get more value capture from customers, for us is moving up the stack and providing solutions. So rather than providing individual chips to companies, we want to solve your hardest problem and provide solutions. So we do that as part of this process of moving up the stack. One of the things we've identified is we will continue to look at opportunities in those three areas to improve and enhance our portfolio, our skills, our time to market, our ability to solve customer problems. What I would say today, though, our most significant focus, sort of from an M&A perspective, is capturing the synergies from our Maxim acquisition. So we are very focused on the execution of getting those synergies right now.
As we think about M&A and really the finance function itself, how are you readying your function to really help enable additional efficiencies, synergies, et cetera, capture over the cycle?
So one of the things we've spent a bunch of time talking about, and we have teams real time working on this, is making sure we have really solid pre and post integration playbooks. We've all seen a lot of deals, and where you see them fail is in the post integration period. They don't capture the value that they had expected when they set the price on the deal. And so having milestones, KPIs that you can look at as you start the integration, and having very good timelines and roadmaps for what activities you do when, whether it's how you onboard employees, how do you deal with real estate, how do you deal with the R&D teams and the management, and combining functions. All of those things, you got to have a plan, because otherwise you're going to miss the value capture. And that's the whole point of these transactions. So our teams are building those playbooks, and having executed a bunch of big transactions, we have a lot of experience doing that. And we've even started to do that down to some of the smaller type acquisitions you might look at, because I do think that's critical. And that's one of the places where finance can really help the broader deal teams, is adding some discipline around the measurements of success once you close the deal.
That's sage advice. As we think about discipline around the measures of success, ADI had annual revenue of $9.4 billion last year, and you spent about 15% of that on R&D. How do you, as CFO, manage that level of spend to ensure ROI?
So it's interesting. I would tell you, from a capital allocation perspective, ADI's first call on capital is R&D. And that is because our business generates value based on the innovation we create. And one of the things that is core principle for ADI is we want to be there first and solve the most complicated problems, which means you got to invest in the R&D. Now, from a tactical perspective, all of our projects go through a review and approval process before they're initiated to assess whether it is a project we like the ROI on. But I would say from a macro perspective, if you step back, how I look at the return on our ROI is we get 4 times ASPs of our average competitor, which is evidence that we are capturing more value with every product we ship out the door than our competitors. And that is, you'll hear me say this, Vince, our CEO says it all the time, that's the innovation premium, which is why we are very R&D heavy, and we tend to be CapEx light relative to our peers, because it is so important for us to keep that innovation premium.
And ADI pays a dividend consistently, and also has several billion of debt. What are your thoughts on paying dividends generally versus, paying down the debt, increasing R&D, as you just mentioned, or doing M&A?
So it's interesting. The company has paid a dividend for an incredibly long time. I think this last quarter was the 21st straight year, and we also increased our dividend. We have a long-term capital allocation model that we've shared with our investors. The last time it was updated broadly was at our 22 Investor Day, which is we will plan to return to investors 100% of our free cash flow. So the way we've done that is through the dividend, which is a pretty significant call on our free cash flow, and then any residual we use to buy back stock. And yes, we do carry some level of debt. And what we've done is we've levered up as we've needed to do acquisitions to help us grow and to invest in things. And then we've levered down, and we're actually at a relatively low leverage compared to our peers. We spent a lot of time looking at what is the optimal leverage when you look at from a weighted average cost of capital, where would you want to sit? And you look at our peer companies. We tend to be relatively under leveraged, so I don't worry too much about the leverage part of it, particularly given, our cash flow generation and our EBITDA volumes. But we are very conscious about the capital allocation strategy.
We're living through some unpredictable times, as we've touched on previously. What advice would you give to finance leaders who are steering through uncertainty right now, whether it's economic shifts, supply chain issues, or technology disruptions?
I think the most important thing we can all do as finance professionals is stay close to your sources of signal. Make sure you are close to your customers, your partners, your suppliers, and your teams, so that you can understand the signal from the noise, so that you can sense, adapt, and make changes to your strategy and your execution based on what you hear, right? You can't do that sitting in your office. You got to get out, around, and listen.
So communication, kind of key, going both ways.
Both ways, absolutely.
Yeah. Looking ahead, how do you anticipate the role of CFO evolving, especially with technology changing so rapidly, over the next 5 or 10 years? It seems like it's already in my career gravitated from kind of a historical focus and that sort of thing. And now it's becoming much more leading into the future and forward looking.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think a bunch of the CFO transformation has been underway and it is continuing, and there's a much higher degree of engagement, responsibility, ownership of by the CFO in both strategy and operations. Right? You described the old model, which is the reporting CFO. These days, companies are not looking for just a reporting CFO. They want one who can help drive strategy and operations. That's going to be important. And I think the tie-in will continue. And CIOs sit in different places in every organization, but there is an incredibly important partnership between the CIO and the CFO going forward, given the dominance that technology is going to play in our ability to execute on strategy and operation. And the other piece is, CFOs going forward are going to have to continue to partner hard with their CEOs on how they drive strategy and execution. You can't just be the reporter anymore.
A recurring theme here, Rich, is that the CFO really needs breadth of expertise here. In that light, what advice would you have for a controller to get to the CFO role, and where should they focus to get exposure to all those areas they need to move up and succeed?
Great question. I think for controllers who want to be CFOs, it is making sure you're out diving deep in the business, getting a complete understanding of what the value drivers are in the business so that you are able to help push and pull those levers, when you get to the CFO role. A lot of folks, and I've dealt with this in a bunch of organizations, view the only way to get ahead in your career is to get promoted. And I have found lateral moves into other functions where you can expand your toolkit are critical. Because as we talked at the beginning, you move from controller to CFO, you might pick up real estate, purchasing, investor relations, treasury. Those are all things that aren't often in the bailiwick of a day-to-day controller. So make a lateral move, get that experience, or at least spend a lot of time with the people that are in those roles, not just inside the controllership circle.
Great advice.
Indeed. Rich, for our final question, we get to ask this of all our guests. Tell us about the best advice you have ever received and the person who gave that advice to you.
Can I give you 2 examples, actually?
Of course.
All right. So the first one, and I can't put a date on it because it was when I was a kid, probably as a teenager who wasn't doing everything he was supposed to do. But my dad said this to me once, and it has stuck with me my whole life, all the way through college and my professional careers. He said to me, if you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it over? And that stuck with me, still is something I think about all the time. And the other one, and this was much later in my career, I was already actually a partner at PwC and a senior partner at PwC, in one of our conversations, offered a piece of advice that I thought was very valuable. It was very simple, but it had a huge impact. He said to me in a meeting, you need to learn to listen slower. What he meant by that advice was, we're all in such a hurry, we're always thinking ahead, and we jump in and finish somebody's sentence so that we can start in with what we want to talk about next. And his advice, and it was really good advice, was slow down, let people finish their sentence, and make sure you understand what it is they're going to deliver from a message perspective before you run on to the next thing. Because that is a tendency that a lot of high performers have to do, is to get moving faster than you should. So those have been 2 pretty powerful influences on me professionally.
Rich, thanks for spending time with us today and giving us all your valuable insights. We wish you the best of luck in your new role.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you guys having me on.
Thank you for joining us today on the Transformational CFO podcast, where we explore the evolving role of the CFO and the strategies for a successful path forward.
We look forward to having you join our next podcast as we continue the conversation with inspirational finance leaders.
The views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect WilliamsMarston's views. It does not constitute accounting, tax, valuation, or other professional advice or services by Williams Marston, and it may not be relied upon for any purpose. This podcast may not be reproduced or republished in whole or in part without the express written consent of Williams Marston.